April 1945 did not begin with a sunrise, nor with the gentle thinning of darkness that usually announces a new day. It began with a tremor that rolled beneath Berlin like a buried giant turning restlessly in its sleep, a deep vibration that passed through stone, steel, bone, and memory alike, rattling shattered windows that no longer had glass, shivering along cracked facades blackened by soot, and settling into the lungs of those who still dared to breathe the thickened air, as if the earth itself had grown weary of carrying the weight of banners, speeches, and marching boots, and was now trying, with slow geological patience, to shrug the war from its shoulders. The sky above the city held no true color anymore. It was not blue, not gray, not even properly black, but a layered, suffocating ceiling of smoke braided with ash and illuminated from below by the intermittent orange pulse of artillery flashes, so that even at dawn the horizon glowed like a wound that refused to close. And the smell, always the smell, drifted everywhere at once. Burned timber, scorched brick, cordite, oil, damp concrete, and something sweeter and far more terrible beneath it all, a scent that clung to clothing and hair and would not wash away, the scent of lives abruptly ended. Streets that once carried trams filled with office clerks and students now lay split and uneven, rails twisted into grotesque shapes, cobblestones loosened by concussive blasts, shop signs hanging by single screws and creaking faintly whenever the ground shook again. And yet, despite the devastation so visible to the eye, the most unsettling transformation was less visible and more pervasive. It was the change in the way the city sounded, because Berlin no longer possessed ordinary urban noise, but instead existed within a continuous, layered roar composed of distant artillery thuds, like enormous doors slamming somewhere beyond the horizon. The sharper crack of rifles snapping from unseen vantage points, the grinding advance of tank tracks crushing debris with mechanical indifference, and, between these violent intrusions, a strange and fragile quiet that lasted only seconds at a time, but felt long enough for the heart to imagine that perhaps, impossibly, it was over, before another detonation tore that illusion apart. Windows without glass became empty eye sockets, staring across avenues choked with rubble. Stairwells opened onto nothing where entire walls had collapsed. Curtains fluttered from upper floors as if still expecting occupants who would never return, and the wind, when it moved, carried fine gray dust that settled on skin and lips and eyelashes, so that even blinking felt like an effort against grit. And in that suspended, trembling dawn, the city seemed less like a capital and more like a vast, wounded organism attempting to survive its own convulsions, its neighborhoods functioning like damaged organs barely communicating with one another, its underground tunnels serving as arteries through which fear and rumor flowed in equal measure, its remaining inhabitants reduced to quiet, shadowed figures, navigating the wreckage with cautious steps, listening not only for the next explosion, but for the possibility, faint, dangerous, almost unimaginable, that this might be the final chapter of something that had once promised a 1,000-year future and was now collapsing inward, minute by minute, into smoke, dust, and silence. The advance of the Exército Vermelho was no longer a distant rumor carried by frightened whispers in cellar shelters, nor a distortion dismissed as enemy exaggeration by fading propaganda broadcasts. It had become a physical presence pressing against the edges of Berlin with relentless certainty, a tightening ring of steel and resolve that could be measured in collapsing defensive lines, in bridges blown too late, in the abrupt silence of radio frequencies that once crackled with confident reports, and in the tremor of armored columns rolling forward through suburbs already reduced to skeletal outlines of former neighborhoods, where gardens lay uprooted by shellfire and church spires leaned at unnatural angles against smoke-stained skies. Their approach announced itself not with a single overwhelming roar, but with a layered symphony of mechanical persistence. The grinding churn of tank treads biting into fractured pavement, the metallic clatter of equipment striking against hulls the clipped commands shouted in hoarse voices between bursts of gunfire, and each sound carried the weight of years of accumulated fury, of villages burned and cities besieged, of families displaced across frozen plains, so that by the time the first Soviet units reached the outer districts, the confrontation felt less like a sudden invasion and more like the final convergence of two immense historical currents that had been surging toward one another since the first shots of the Eastern campaign were fired. Defensive barricades erected from overturned trams, sandbags, and splintered furniture offered symbolic resistance more than strategic advantage, and young conscripts with hollow cheeks and oversized helmets peered from behind makeshift cover at shapes emerging through smoke, their training colliding with raw instinct as artillery shells arced overhead and detonated with concussive force that shattered masonry into airborne fragments, while seasoned Red Army infantry advanced methodically from building to building, clearing rooms with practiced efficiency, aware that every doorway might conceal a desperate last stand or a civilian cowering in terror. Along the avenues leading toward the city center, burned-out vehicles formed jagged obstacles that forced tanks to maneuver cautiously, their turrets swiveling in deliberate arcs as snipers concealed in upper stories sought fleeting targets. And in that maze of debris and fractured facades, the battle assumed an intimacy that stripped away grand strategy and reduced conflict to seconds-long decisions. A finger tightening on a trigger, a grenade released into a stairwell, a shouted warning misunderstood amid echoing blasts, so that progress was measured not in sweeping territorial gains, but in meters reclaimed at staggering human cost. Smoke drifted through corridors stripped of doors, mingling with plaster dust and the acrid sting of discharged ammunition, and the distinction between combatant and bystander blurred in the chaos, as families emerging with raised hands navigated corridors of armed men whose faces bore the exhaustion of long campaigns, stretching back through snowbound trenches and scorched farmland, their eyes reflecting not only determination, but also the cumulative burden of witnessing devastation across an entire continent. Meanwhile, command posts improvised within partially intact structures relayed updates across tangled communication lines. Maps were annotated with hurried markings that became obsolete within hours, and the encirclement tightened with mathematical inevitability, severing supply routes and isolating pockets of resistance that clung to instructions already detached from unfolding reality. As daylight filtered weakly through smoke, illuminating drifting particles like suspended ash from a colossal fire, the realization settled over defenders and attackers alike that the struggle unfolding in these streets was not merely another engagement in a protracted war, but the climactic compression of years of violence into a confined urban crucible where ideology, vengeance, survival, and fear converged amid shattered stone, and where each advancing step carried symbolic weight far beyond the rubble underfoot, signaling that the center of a once expansive dominion was being reduced, block by block, to contested ground in a battle whose outcome, though increasingly apparent, demanded to be fought through to its irreversible conclusion. Beneath layers of reinforced concrete and packed earth, far below the trembling avenues and collapsing facades, the bunker existed in a distorted sense of time that felt detached from the burning city above, as though it were suspended in an artificial twilight where clocks ticked, but meaning lagged behind events, where the air hung stale and overused despite the mechanical hum of ventilation systems straining to recycle breath already thick with tension, cigarette smoke, and the sour trace of fear, and where narrow corridors painted in dull, institutional colors absorbed whispered conversations that never fully dissipated, lingering instead like an invisible residue along the walls. Electric bulbs cast a harsh, unflattering light that flattened faces and deepened shadows beneath eyes grown hollow from sleepless nights, and maps pinned to boards displayed arrows and unit symbols that suggested coherence and control, even as reports arriving from the surface contradicted the neat, geometry of those colored lines, revealing divisions shattered, supply routes severed, and positions overrun in rapid succession. Yet within this subterranean enclave, language itself seemed to bend in order to preserve fragments of certainty, with phrases like regrouping, temporary setback, and imminent counteraction, repeated often enough to momentarily disguise the accelerating collapse. At the center of this strained theater of denial remained Adolf Hitler, increasingly withdrawn into a narrowing circle of loyalists, his physical presence marked by trembling hands that struggled to remain steady over documents, by a posture that alternated between rigid defiance and visible fatigue, and by a voice that could shift abruptly from measured insistence to explosive accusation, as though volume alone might reverse battlefield realities unfolding kilometers away, while aides moved with calculated efficiency, delivering situation briefings whose phrasing had to balance honesty with survival, aware that candor could provoke fury, yet fabrication could not alter the tightening encirclement. The bunker's rooms, though modest in size, bore the weight of disproportionate consequence, for within them decisions were debated that could no longer meaningfully influence outcomes, yet still determined how the end would be narrated, and the atmosphere oscillated between forced routine, shared meals eaten in strained quiet, administrative tasks performed with mechanical diligence, and sudden surges of agitation when communications from outer districts confirmed further breaches, each update eroding another layer of the illusion that reinforcements might materialize from some overlooked reserve. Footsteps echoed along corridors as officers conferred in low tones, their uniforms increasingly creased and dust-marked from brief excursions to the surface, their expressions reflecting the internal calculus of loyalty versus self-preservation, and in those exchanges one could sense the fragmentation of conviction, the gradual recognition that the architecture of authority surrounding them was less granite than plaster, prone to cracking under sustained pressure. Telephones rang intermittently, their sharp chime cutting through background murmurs, and operators repeated coordinates and casualty estimates into receivers that connected to command nodes already compromised or silenced, while typists continued recording directives whose implementation depended on units that had ceased to respond, creating a growing archive of orders detached from execution. The bunker's reinforced doors, designed to shield against external bombardment, inadvertently heightened psychological confinement, sealing its occupants within a reality increasingly defined by reports rather than first-hand observation, so that imagination filled gaps left by incomplete information, conjuring either improbable breakthroughs or catastrophic breaches with equal intensity, and as hours blended into one another without natural markers of sunrise or dusk, fatigue deepened, tempers shortened, and even the most steadfast adherents confronted a creeping awareness that the narrative of invincibility cultivated for years was dissolving in real time. Occasional attempts at normalcy, a formal announcement delivered with ceremonial tone, a discussion of protocol, the meticulous organization of files, assumed an almost ritualistic quality, as though adherence to procedure might impose structure. Upon disintegration, yet beneath these gestures lay an undercurrent of inevitability, a recognition unspoken but palpable that the subterranean refuge, engineered to withstand external assault, could not fortify belief against accumulating evidence, and thus the bunker became not merely a command center, but a crucible of psychological unraveling, where authority confronted its own limits, where ambition collided with consequence, and where the final acts of a regime unfolded not amid triumphant fanfare, but within enclosed rooms heavy with recycled air, artificial light, and the relentless approach of forces closing in from every direction above. Above ground, as the encirclement tightened and resistance fractured into isolated pockets, Berlin's final days unfolded not as a single climactic clash, but as a series of intimate catastrophes playing out simultaneously across kitchens, courtyards, stairwells, and shattered boulevards, where civilians and soldiers moved through the same devastated spaces with different purposes, yet identical uncertainty, and where survival depended less on ideology than on instinct. sharpened by exhaustion. In districts once defined by cafes and bookstores, apartment blocks stood split open, revealing cross-sections of private lives, wallpaper patterned with faded flowers, picture frames hanging crooked over rooms exposed to open air, wardrobes spilled across floors layered in dust. And through these ruins people navigated cautiously, stepping over beams and broken glass while scanning the skyline for movement, unsure whether the next sound would signal liberation or lethal crossfire. As artillery, shells continued to arc overhead and detonate with concussive force that rippled through already weakened foundations. Mothers clutched children whose questions went unanswered. Elderly residents descended into cellars carrying whatever belongings they could salvage, and young conscripts stationed at intersections peered down avenues lined with debris, their expressions caught between rehearsed resolve and dawning comprehension that the battle they had been promised as glorious had devolved into a desperate defense of rubble, while Red Army units advanced methodically, clearing buildings room by room with a discipline forged in previous campaigns, aware that each threshold might conceal a sniper or a frightened family emerging with raised hands, and in that tense choreography of advance and retreat, shouted commands overlapped with pleas for mercy in a cacophony that blurred language into urgency. Smoke drifted low across streets where tram cables sagged like severed nerves, and fires smoldered in storefronts whose shattered displays no longer advertised goods but framed the collapse of normalcy itself as the infrastructure that had once organized daily rhythms, electricity grids, water lines, public transport, failed in irregular intervals, plunging blocks into darkness or cutting off access to clean water, forcing residents to improvise solutions amid ongoing bombardment, filling buckets from cracked pipes or melting ice gathered from shaded courtyards, all while navigating the unpredictable patterns of combat that transformed familiar routes into lethal corridors. In hospitals overwhelmed beyond capacity, doctors triaged patients under impossible constraints, choosing who might be saved with limited supplies and who would be made comfortable as life ebbed away, their decisions accompanied by the distant percussion of shelling that underscored each moment with urgency, and in makeshift shelters rumors circulated at a pace rivaling troop movements, speculating about surrender, about counterattacks, about escape routes that might remain open for a few critical hours, even as official broadcasts continued to project confidence detached from observable reality. As night fell, the city did not darken into rest, but into a dim, flickering half-light produced by fires and sporadic flares, casting elongated shadows across rubble-strewn avenues and illuminating columns of smoke rising into a sky already saturated with ash, while sporadic gunfire echoed unpredictably, ricocheting between facades and creating the illusion of proximity, even when combat occurred blocks away. And within that unstable landscape, acts of cruelty and compassion unfolded side by side, looting in abandoned shops, neighbors sharing dwindling food reserves, soldiers offering water to civilians before moving on, gestures that revealed the spectrum of human response under extreme pressure. By the time the central districts became the primary focus of engagement, the PDAO, cumulative strain on infrastructure and morale rendered organized defense increasingly untenable, and yet pockets of resistance persisted, motivated by fear of retribution, by ingrained loyalty, or simply by the inability to envision an alternative, so that the confrontation extended longer than strategic logic might dictate, prolonging destruction and deepening the scars etched into the urban fabric. When the fighting finally subsided into sporadic exchanges and then into cautious quiet, the transition felt less like a decisive endpoint and more like an exhausted pause, a fragile stillness settling over avenues littered with debris and memory, where survivors emerged slowly from basements and shelters to assess a landscape transformed beyond recognition, stepping into streets layered with dust and silence, aware that whatever political declarations would soon formalize the war's conclusion, the lived reality of those final days the fragmentation of neighborhoods, the collapse of certainty, the intimate proximity of loss, would endure long after the last gunshot faded into history. The air below was damp and heavy, saturated with the metallic scent of blood. Lanterns hung from improvised wires, swaying with each distant explosion, casting moving shadows along cracked tiled walls. She was only 19, but her eyes had aged decades. Before the war, she had dreamed of studying medicine in Heidelberg, writing lively letters about difficult exams, walking along the river with friends. Now she pressed blood-soaked gauze against torn flesh and learned to recognize, by the rhythm of breathing alone, when someone was about to leave this world. The trains had stopped months ago. The platforms were rows of stretchers. Abandoned carriages served as crude operating rooms where surgeons worked under insufficient light, sterilizing instruments in dented pots. There was not enough anesthesia, not enough antibiotics, not enough anything, except suffering. One night, they brought in a boy whose uniform hung too large on his thin frame. He could not have been older than 13. In his pocket was a folded pamphlet promising final victory. A fragment of shrapnel had pierced his chest. Anna pressed firmly against the wound as he opened his eyes for a brief moment. He asked in a faint voice whether Berlin was still holding. Her silence lasted only a second, but it felt endless. "Yes," she said. He smiled, satisfied, as though he had fulfilled his duty. Then his body grew still. Anna continued holding his small hand long after he was gone. In that moment, she understood that the war was not merely destroying buildings, it was devouring childhood itself. Across the city, Sergeant Mikhail Sokolov moved carefully through smoking ruins. He had crossed half of Eastern Europe to reach this place. He had survived the brutal starvation of the Battaglia de Stalingrado. He had endured the metallic thunder of the Battaglia de Kursk, where tanks collided like furious giants. He had buried friends in frozen ground and written letters that may never have reached their destination. Berlin was supposed to mean triumph. It was the heart of the enemy, the symbol that had fueled Soviet determination for years. But what he saw did not resemble a beating heart. It resembled collapse. Buildings split open like exposed bones. Women running with children in their arms. Old men standing silently in doorways, as if history had finally exhausted them. Every corner was a threat. Snipers fired from behind torn curtains. Grenades rolled up staircases before doors were pushed open. Urban combat was suffocatingly intimate. There was no distance between enemies. Sometimes Mikhail saw fear in the eyes of the German soldier before pulling the trigger. Sometimes he saw only exhaustion. The same exhaustion he carried inside himself. Beneath tons of concrete, inside the suffocating interior of the bunker, the world seemed to exist only on maps marked with lines that no longer reflected reality. There remained Adolf Hitler, increasingly isolated, trembling hands sliding across reports, eyes fixed on divisions that had already been crushed. Generals spoke of counterattacks that were impossible. Orders were issued to armies that no longer existed. Denial had its own scent: sweat, fear, and forced silence. Lucas Reinhardt, a young communications officer, walked the narrow corridors with measured steps. He had grown up believing the Reich would last 1,000 years. He had been taught to trust, to obey, not to question. Now he watched men argue over fantasies while the world above them disintegrated. On April 22nd, when it became clear that no relief force would break the encirclement, tension exploded. Shouts reverberated against concrete walls. Accusations of betrayal flew like shrapnel. Lucas felt something shift inside him. It was not only fear, it was the realization that he was witnessing the death of a myth. On April 29th, while Berlin burned, Hitler married Eva Braun in a brief, almost surreal ceremony. Papers were signed, glasses were raised, a small toast was made. Above them, tanks moved closer. Lucas watched as though observing a stage play performed at the end of the world. It was not celebration, it was farewell. The next day, a muffled gunshot echoed through the bunker. The news spread in whispers. Hitler was dead. Some officers chose the same fate. Others attempted escape. Lucas stood motionless for seconds that felt like hours. Then he made a quiet decision. He gathered documents, reports, internal records, fragments of truth that could not be allowed to vanish beneath rubble. If everything was ending, the truth had to survive. On the surface, the battle converged on the ultimate symbol of power. The Reichstag rose before Soviet troops as a charred shell. The steps were covered in debris and bodies. Mikhail climbed them one by one, the weight of years pressing into his legs. When the Soviet flag was finally raised, the image would travel across the world as a symbol of victory. But in that moment, there was no roaring celebration. There was silence. A heavy silence broken only by wind moving through shattered windows. Mikhail leaned against a wall scarred by bullets and let his rifle rest at his side. He thought of his mother, of the distant village he had left behind, of the friends who were not there to see that day. He thought of his sister, who had never returned from the front as a nurse, and he wept, not from joy, but from exhaustion, because at last, after years, the noise was beginning to fade. When the fighting subsided and the echo of explosions gave way to an uneasy quiet, Anna climbed the subway stairs for the first time in days. Daylight felt unreal, almost artificial. She walked through streets she no longer recognized. Buildings stood open like broken boxes. Twisted rails cut across avenues. The city seemed suspended between past and future. She stopped where her father's bakery had once stood. There was no facade, no doorway, no scent of bread, only scattered bricks and burned beams. She knelt among the rubble. She did not cry. Her tears had already been spent underground. Days later, surrender would be signed. The war in Europe would officially end. But the end did not bring immediate relief. It brought mourning, trials, questions that would echo for generations. How had it come to this? How had an entire nation believed until the final hour? How had millions been led to death by promises of greatness that delivered only ruin? Berlin would rebuild slowly, brick by brick, bridge by bridge. People like Anna would choose to save lives instead of watching them fade. Men like Mikhail would try to relearn how to sleep without flinching. Young officers like Lucas would carry the burden of testimony. The last message of Berlin was not broadcast over radio. It was not a final speech. It lived in smaller acts, in the nurse who lied to comfort a dying child, in the soldier who lowered his weapon when he realized there was nothing left to defend, in the officer who chose truth over silence. Amid ruins and dust, the city whispered something to the world. A warning etched in smoke and memory. Empires may promise 1,000 years. Hatred can destroy them in far less. And even in the darkest ending, humanity survives in fragile individual choices. Quiet, almost invisible, yet strong enough to outlive the fire. When the final shot faded and the sky cleared without smoke for the first time in days, it was not victory that defined that moment. It was silence, a silence heavy with memory. A silence that seemed to say, without words, never again.